welcome to the Rocking the Journey podcast. Now, Rock My Age, the absolute essence of Rock My Age is about women of every age really flourishing and showing up as their best self, whatever the circumstances are. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by a US-based clinical psychologist, and flourishing is the very essence of her work too. So I'm looking forward to some great conversation today. So welcome, Dr. Lara Pence.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Debbie. I love connecting with people from all over the globe. So this is super, super exciting for me. And your energy is already infectious. So I'm excited to be here.
I mean, isn't that great, actually, this technology that we can kind of talk across the seas and get expertise from all around the world, which is so great for our community. So
it is. It's pretty spectacular and amazing, and I think allows us to also to diversify like our own thinking, because even just in our own communities and societies and states and countries, we can be rather one track minded. And so any chance we have to really sort of just diversify the way that we think about things, I think is an opportunity we should all take.
Fantastic. Now, as I said just before we came on air, that I feel I've spent probably the past week, I always research my guests really well, but I really got into your work, and I really love the fact that you are no nonsense, pretty challenging, I would say, and like some other psychologists we've had in this program, that real focus on doing the work on yourself. So I want to capture that in a moment. But I want to start with a post that you posted on International Women's Day. And at Rock My Age, we did the same, the woke post, women supporting women. And then I saw you say something which I went, oh my God, that so speaks to my experience, I started as a fashion journalist and then went into TV. And actually my experience was that women as well as men, but it didn't mean because you had a woman boss that you were going to be supported and pushed forward. And actually they could be the worst people to work for. I'm going to be equally controversial. So tell me your theory about this. Explain more, and what that post that you posted and what was behind that.
Yeah. So for me, I knew International Women's Day was coming up, and I knew that there was going to be lots of conversation around how we support each other and how we empower each other and lift each other up. And, I have seen that, certainly. I have seen that happen. But unfortunately, I've seen the other side actually happen more, which is women snubbing other women and, slicing and dicing them along their path to success. And I think that we are our own harshest critic. And after that comes other women. In my experience, and it was interesting when I was just even thinking about my own life as I was sort of composing the post and really considering what I wanted to say, because I wanted to certainly say it thoughtfully, but also be, as you identified me in the beginning, kind of no nonsense and like, let's be real here. Let's really talk about this. I brought it to my own attention and just my own curiosity around sort of, my experience that primarily in my life, actually, the closest allies that I've had up to this point as a 41-year-old woman have been men. That I have found actually that they have been sort of the most supportive and the least challenging in that way. And so, so I had to even do some deep diving around that. Do I gravitate more towards men because I'm biased maybe towards, women and the competitive features that can show up for women, and also, the real, I think, struggle that we get in with each other. So I had my own kind of deep dive around that, Debbie, and certainly got curious about it myself. But I think also, as a psychologist who's worked primarily with women for the last 15 years, and also, I've been the director of a nonprofit specifically designed towards women. I've worked in facilities that are only, geared towards women. I mean, it's been very female centric in a lot of ways in a lot of the work that I've done. I have really found that that we struggle with each other, that we have a difficult time really seeing another woman as successful and saying, man, this is so great. How did she get there? Like what is it about what she's doing that's allowing her to be successful? Our first go-to is typically to tear her down in some way. Well, she probably got that because of what she wore, or she probably got that because of what she did. There's just sort of this, we lead with criticism instead of leading with curiosity. And
you know what, Lara, this is because I've done years of therapy and really think I know myself well, and I've sorted some of this stuff out. I'm a mother of daughters and a grandmother of a little girl as well. So, and I had to check myself, because when I read this, I thought, have I always been that supportive to other women? And I think I'm quite a naturally competitive person. So where does it all start? Where does that kind of behavior start? Is it your own attitude towards yourself and how self-critical you are?
I think there's a few different seeds. I think the first seed certainly is that we often, our brain likes patterns, right? We like what we're familiar with. It's like that's what, when we're in kindergarten, we put all the circles in the circle pile and all the triangles in the triangle pile and all the squares in the square pile. And so we're naturally inclined to something that's as close to us as possible. We're naturally inclined to look at that and say either that is like me or not like me. It's like that's our brain at work. That's the heuristic, right? It just wants a quick solution. And so, in the most sort of global stereotypical way, we see female versus male, female most like me, right? Same gender, all that kind of stuff. And so I think naturally our just from like a brain science, psychological human behavior standpoint, our brain immediately says like, is this person like me or not like me? And if there's any kind of big gap between where they are and we might be, right? Let's say we see a mom that feels like that, she just seems like, man, she's mom killing it. Like she is just the best mom. She always packs the best lunch and like, exactly, immediately we're like, she's not like me.
Yeah.
And so then because of that, because there's this immediate gap, we can do one of two things. We either criticize her or we criticize ourselves. Right. And so it's either there's something that she's doing that put her there that isn't so great and let's highlight it, or there's something that I'm not doing that isn't matching up to what she's doing. And so what's wrong with me? Yeah. So I think, that's just sort of like the immediate, the psychology around this comparison and competitiveness. I think there's also an element, of course, one could argue, that women have had a more difficult time coming up in the ranks in particular positions. Yeah. And so, towards the end of my post, I said something like, there's always a woman who's right behind us wanting to scoop up, what we have if we fail. Yeah. And I think some of that is sort of this narrative, and I do believe it's a bit of a narrative that that there's only so many positions for women. And so it sort of breeds this inherent competitiveness. So I think that's part of it. And then I also just think, listen, I mean, for better or for worse, we are complicated. Like women are ultra feeling multifaceted, not able to compartmentalize human beings. And so we carry a lot of stuff in our emotional virtual backpack all the time. And so whether we've had issues with our own mother or with our own sister or, growing up with the peer group on the playground, like we bring that into the present. And so that's why I think we have to be real curious about just our own relationships with other women and do exactly what you did, Debbie, which is ask ourselves like, wow, how supportive have I been? Yeah. When I see a woman that's successful or when I see a woman that that has something that I also want, do I first criticize or do I first get curious? And I think that's part of it.
Now, you mentioned the C word, the curiosity word, and I just know from the years of self-development, and still lots to do, definitely still lots to do, but your work around curiosity and how important that is really spoke to me about when I started to feel better, was when I started to get curious. I read a lot about the Carol Dweck, the growth mindset, which I really loved that work as well. So tell us more about how important curiosity is in your therapeutic work. And also, just to mention, you train elite athletes, you train business people. We're all human beings. I guess there's lots of the same issues, but tell me about curiosity.
Yeah, curiosity for me is a game changer. And it became a game changer in my own work in real time with my clients when I shifted away from working hard to do therapy, like to be with my clients and say all the right things and do all the right things, to really being with my client and creating space and getting curious alongside them. And I noticed that in my own work as a psychologist, the more curious I became with them and the more vulnerable, the more vulnerability that I demonstrated with them, by starting sentences like, gosh, you know what? I don't know why that happens. Let's get curious about it. Like, if you were to guess, what would you think? So more sentences like that really sparked this idea that we can do this together and collaborate. The better the work became in the space, because it really, first of all, I think to many of my clients felt like, wow, I'm human and I don't have all the answers. And, I'm also not coming at this from a hierarchical standpoint where I know better than you and you don't know enough, so I'm going to teach you. It's more like, wow, we're learning about this sort of together. There's a certain expertise, of course, that I'm bringing into the space as a psychologist, but you specifically as the human being in the work that I'm doing with you, gosh, you know actually so much more about yourself than I do. So let's get curious about that together. So in my own work, Debbie, I really noticed that as soon as I started really highlighting curiosity and moving into that space, other people, my clients were willing to get curious with me. And I think that there's the starting point of curiosity that for me really begins with the questions that we ask ourselves. And I think too often we're asking ourselves questions that begin with the word why. Why do I do this?
Yeah.
Why am I not good enough? Why does this matter to me? And I think that leads us down the wrong path. And I think immediately it evokes and invokes defensiveness and as if something's wrong. And so for me, I've really shifted just the way that I think about things, that instead of thinking about what's wrong here, let's think about what's right. And let's get curious about, like, well, instead of why does this matter? Why does this matter to me? How about what about this matters to me? And why did I do this again? What about what's going on allowed me to repeat a pattern that I know might not be good for me? So it's a simple shift in language, but in leading with that curiosity, people begin to let down their defensiveness and really begin to open up and enter into the space of vulnerability, which is just huge.
Because vulnerability is such a big issue, isn't it, for women? And interestingly, I live in London, and there's been a horrendous case this week of a woman who has been taken off the streets and murdered. And the sense of female anger and vulnerability, you can feel it in the air. And I just thought it's, and I'm very a big fan of Brene Brown's work on vulnerability, but it just, I found there's a real kind of conflict about us needing to feel confident and powerful, perhaps in our female power, but also dealing with this vulnerability. And I think that's quite particularly for young women, I think that's a difficult thing to compute. So how important is that? I think, because you talked about self-compassion, and you're about talking compassionately up to yourself. So how important are these things, and how do we kind of make sense of the whole gambit of how we're supposed to show up and not being too vulnerable in certain circumstances and all those kind of things?
I hear you. And I love that you're asking this question, because I think two things. I think it highlights the difficulty of vulnerability, really. And I think it also highlights how we can take a construct and run with it in a way that maybe that construct actually wasn't meant to be applied. And I think so, from my perspective, when I think about vulnerability, where I see vulnerability as being the most useful and where you get the most return on investment is with your trusted allies, is with, those people in your life that matter so much to you, and that, are in the tiny little inner circle of the bullseye. And I think that we've taken this construct of vulnerability and we have sort of blown it up as if, sort of this like, oh, well, I can be vulnerable, so I should be vulnerable with everybody.
Yeah.
And even Brene Brown would say, no, there's a difference between vulnerability and oversharing, right? And there's a difference between vulnerability for vulnerability's sake and connectedness, and vulnerability to hotwire connection with other people. And so I think, Debbie, what you're really highlighting is our need to really check in with our own desire to be vulnerable in any given moment, right? Like, to me, there is maybe no such thing as vulnerability with 5 million followers on Instagram, because it's not safe. Inherently, 5 million followers is not a safe container. Vulnerability is, there's uncertainty and there's risk, but there is a level of safety because it's with a trusted ally. And so to me, I think that's really important. And I think that's where women can really understand, listen, I can be vulnerable with my most trusted allies. And by the way, vulnerability is not synonymous with weakness, right? Vulnerability it can be strength and courage. And I can also be empowered and be assertive in the boardroom and among my peers, and not always feel like I have to show all shades of myself to everyone at every moment.
Yeah. And that takes some navigating, doesn't it? And it's quite complicated to kind of when we should do that and when we shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I guess, therapy is the kind of help you offer is really expensive. It can take a long time. So where should you is there a kind of quick way of women watching this and think, actually, I really like this, I'd like to ask the questions, like to do some work on myself, but I haven't got the time, haven't got the finances to go and spend years talking to a therapist. Can you give some kind of practical advice to where people could go?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think where people could go first, Debbie, is inward. I think people can start asking themselves really important questions. The first being, what are my values? What matters to me? And I think values-driven work can really, really help set the stage for an incredible foundation of what you do next. And what I mean by values are the principles by which you choose to live your life.
Yeah.
And so each person on this planet, from my perspective, should understand what matters to them from a principle standpoint. If they no longer are on this planet, what do they want said about them when they leave? What do they really want to exude, and how do they really want to contribute in this world? So I think oftentimes the questions that people can ask themselves can come from within. What do I value? What matters to me? Who matters to me? What are the patterns that are showing up for me regularly? And what about those patterns might need to change, or I might need to attend to? Because certainly, as you said, whether it's therapy or these long, intensive weekends that are $5,000, like it can be an investment. And I think that's why we can just start with asking ourselves better questions. I actually launched a product this year called Lifebox, which is a box filled with questions. And it's under $50. And it's basically, if you do a card every other day, it's a year of quote unquote therapy. You just getting the kinds of questions that you would from a licensed psychologist, myself, carefully curated. So there, I think, are definitely ways for us to self-heal and self-repair. And I think it just starts with asking ourselves better questions.
Fantastic, great. Now, flexibility, you mentioned a lot in your work as well. And I've certainly when I went to therapy, started to notice where people just observing how my loved ones, you could see areas, including myself, by the way, being really inflexible. And that was another big learning I had to actually know that you can shift some of these things. You don't have to stay in these belief systems. I honestly believed, and I know this is a particular area of yours, that to be valuable in the world, I had to be 8.5 stone. You know, as soon as I was a little bit, fortunately, at my age 57, I have grown out of this. But it was such a strong belief system for me. And you can see how people can get stuck in this. And so tell me more about the importance of being flexible. And
yeah, so the truth is we get stuck in patterns, right? Not only patterns of doing things, but ways of feeling things. We can get overly attached to emotional cycles, right? So we wake up in the morning and the first thing we say is, I didn't get enough sleep, which sets us up to immediately feel tired or that we're not going to have enough energy for the day, right? And then we go throughout our day, and what we just say out loud often is, oh, I'm so stressed, or I'm so overwhelmed. Not even necessarily checking in with yourself to see, do I actually really feel that way? Or am I just so used to saying that it pops out when I have a moment to breathe, right? So I think that we can get attached to ways of thinking, feeling, being, and relating. And flexibility is really about being able to flex outside of that, right? It's being able to consider alternative options. It's being able to think, okay, if I wake up today and the first thing out of my mouth is, and I didn't get enough sleep, what if the first thing out of my mouth is, wow, I'm so grateful that I have a nice bed? What if you just like shift a little bit the way that you're thinking? And so I think that part is really huge. The other thing that I think is really huge, and curiosity ties back into that, which your audience by the end of this is going to be like, if I hear the word curiosity one more time. But is being curious about the way other people think, feel, and behave. And I say this a lot too in my work, that what you're reading, watching, and listening to should not always be things that you enjoy. Sometimes I think it needs to be things that make you uncomfortable. And I think that exercise is really useful, because then you are putting yourselves in situations that get you out of these patterns, get you out of these comfort zones. And that inevitably not only changes your own brain chemistry, but exposes you to different states of being, which then can really begin to change the way that you see the world and the way that you see yourself. You have to, from my perspective, Debbie, and it might sound crazy for people to hear this because I'm a psychologist, but nobody ever changed just by talking and discussing things. You have to start exposing and doing things. And so I think that part is really important too.
That's because, again, that was something else I picked up from you, that actually, and I have just, for the first time ever, blocked somebody on social media. It was a guy who just made not a particularly offensive comment, but just about this situation, because London is just so full of this story at the moment, and had made a comment about women shouldn't be walking alone at night. And I was so furious about it, I blocked him. And then I read what you said about this, about not leaving discussions open. So was I right to do that?
Oh gosh, what a great question. So here's what I think. I mean, listen, the truth is, we also have to get through the day, right? And so there are times where we can't be all things to all people, where we can't be curious all the time, where we can't be vulnerable to our most trusted allies for one reason or another. And we have to self-preserve, I think. So I guess the way that I would say that is, listen, if you blocked him and he doesn't come into your conscious awareness since then, and it's just sort of like gone, good riddance. fine. I mean, I think in those situations, certainly there have been
Yeah.
people that have reached out to me with wildly inappropriate messages, and
Yeah.
I've just hit delete, delete.
Yeah. Especially because
Um,
it was interesting when you said that. It is quite, I think that is, again, this kind of balance, because it is quite powerful, isn't it? When you get somebody who's
yes.
saying, who's starting to be inoffensive, and you can just, I just love it, hit that button. But, but I
I
think
think
you're
the
right. I
thing
think
that we
checking
have to,
again with that we're not closing down debate and having
yes.
different views, I think is
Exactly, exactly, exactly. And I think that's where I think really, and in the US, 2020 highlighted this significantly in a way that really scared me, is that people were not only really willing to stay in their echo chambers, but actively pursuing echo chambers. Many people, for example, who posted something on Instagram that indicated where they stood politically, they would then come back a few posts later and say, for those of you who unfollowed me because now you know that I support this politician or that politician, so be it. I'm glad that you don't follow me anymore. And what I thought to myself is, gosh, like that just doesn't feel like the right approach. I understand if maybe you don't, it doesn't matter to you what these people's opinions are of your own view and value, but we should be able to have an open market system where we can hear each other's views and opinions and not seek unification through them. That's not how we unify, is through opinion. And so I think that part, there is a balance that you need to find, of course, but I do think that there's such utility in being exposed to the way that other people think. I mean, in truth, therapy is the perfect example of this, because a client comes into my office, we create space where they feel safe and can share. Undoubtedly, the way that they think, behave, relate, or feel is going to be different than me, because I'm a different human being. And so, if they, for example, tell me a story and then they look at me and they're like, I mean, don't you think I have reason to be pissed? And I say, well, actually, I'm not sure, and like highlight maybe a different perspective,
yeah.
and we're respectful with each other, and we're in
But
this
it's
safe
tough,
place.
isn't it? Therapy is
Yes.
tough.
Yes. Therapy is tough in
It's
that way
not
for
an
sure.
easy ride to sort.
Exactly.
And
But
the
I think that,
therapists don't agree with you. And
y-
I've
yeah, I mean, and I think that's honestly the most useful kind too. I think
yeah,
when therapists can highlight the alternative, or it's, oh my gosh, I've been thinking that I'm not good enough for 7 years of my life. Don't you, Dr. L, think you're not good enough? I mean, you must think it all the time. Actually, sometimes I think it, but
yeah,
most of the time, this is actually the way I think, so I think that exposure is really important to people.
yeah. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. But I just have a few questions which I've asked you to think about, which we ask all our guests. So I just want you to talk us through them now. So the first thing is the book that changed your life.
So the book that changed my life, and I know, sometimes this is my own transparency, Debbie, but sometimes when people ask me that question, I feel like I have to say like a Great Expectations one, like a Moby Dick or something really like profound. But the book that changed my life is a book called Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, who also wrote Everything is Illuminated. And it's a book about his own journey into understanding factory farming and becoming vegan. And after I read that book, it completely changed my own relationship with food and the way that I think about it. So that is the book that had the biggest influence on my life.
It's amazing.
And it was brilliantly written. He's a brilliant writer.
Really amazing. And the film that changed your life.
So this one is again one of those like, oh gosh, I should probably say something really profound. But the film that has changed my life was The Accused, which was a film that Jodie Foster was in. And the subject matter is actually quite intense. She is a woman who's raped in a bar by multiple individuals. But the way that it changed my life is it allowed me, I was really young when I saw it, probably too young. My parents exposed me to a few things, probably way too young. But it allowed me to really understand how powerful women can be. And when they fight for what they believe in, that they really can change and do good and create justice. So that to me, I think in so many ways, like instilled a level of confidence very, very young.
Yeah, brilliant. And the song that makes you cry?
So this one is Just the Way You Are by Bruno Mars. And I mean, it's super easy. Like when I was a first mom, I would sing it to my kiddo. And I think it was even playing when one of my children, I can't remember which one, was born. So it just like immediately when it comes on, the melody is like sob, 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 sob.
Lovely. And the third and the last one, I want you to pad this out a little bit and explain why, that the best piece of advice you've ever been given.
Yes. So that came from my dad. And it was a saying that he said to me before I was going to go on stage and present something. He said, just keep this in mind, be brilliant, be brief, and be seated. And, he's been was in the entertainment business for a long time. And so he would often present movies to people. And he tuned into the fact that audiences didn't want to hear a lot of what you wanted to say. They wanted to get to the business. They wanted to watch the movie. And for me, it was helpful for that presentation. But in life, it's really allowed me to understand that you can make an impact with very few words, and then you can be quiet and listen to what other people have to say. And that has also just been something that has like coursed through my DNA for a long time. And I'm super grateful for my dad because of it.
Lara Pence, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Debbie. This was so fun. I appreciate it.
We appreciate it very much too.